All right, hey there. This is Jesse Johnson again, and I'm just going to be continuing to read out of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. As we had left off, Axel and Otto had just joined up with an Icelandic guide on their quest to the center of Snailful volcano, in search for the titular center of the Earth. And as we left off, they'd only just reached Snailful, and as such, we're going to start right in with Chapter 15, Snailful at Last. Snailful is 5,000 feet high. Its double cone forms the end of a trachytic belt which stands out distinctly in the mountain system of the island. From our starting point, we couldn't make out the two peaks against the dark gray sky. I could only see an enormous cap of snow descending low on the giant's brow. We walked in single file, led by the hunter, climbing up on the long narrow tracks where two people could not have walked abreast. Conversation was therefore almost impossible. After we had passed the basalt wall of the Stapi fjord, we walked over fibrous, peaty soil created from the ancient vegetation of this peninsula. The vast quantity of this unharvested fuel would be sufficient to warm the whole population of Iceland for a century. This huge peat bog was as much as 70 feet deep in places, to judge from the gorges in it, and it consisted of layers of the carbonized remains of vegetation interspersed with thinner layers of tufaceous pumice. As a true nephew of Professor Liedenbrock, and in spite of my worries, I couldn't help taking an interest in the mineralogical curiosities which lay about me, as if in a vast vacuum, and I worked out in my mind a complete geological account of Iceland. This most curious island has evidently been forced up from the bottom of the sea at a comparatively recent date. It may possibly still be rising slowly. If this is the case, its origin may well be attributed to subterranean fires, in which case Sir Humphrey Davy's theory, Newsom's document, and my uncle's opinions would all go up in smoke. This hypothesis led me to examine even more carefully the appearance of the ground, and I soon arrived at a conclusion as to the nature of the forces operating in its formation. Iceland, which is entirely devoid of alluvial soil, is wholly composed of volcanic tufa, that is to say, an agglomeration of porous rocks and stones. Before the volcanoes erupted, it consisted of trap rocks slowly raised to the level of the sea by the action of forces in the center of the earth. The internal fires had not yet forced their way through. But at a later period, a wide chasm formed diagonally, from southwest to northeast, through which the trachyte that was to form a mountain chain was gradually forced out. There was no violent activity in this change. The matter was thrown out in vast quantities, and the liquid material oozing out from the abysses of the earth slowly spread in extensive plains or in hillocky masses. To this period belong the feldspars, sienites, and porphyrites. But with this outflow, the thickness of the island's crust increased considerably, and therefore also its powers of resistance. One can easily imagine what vast quantities of gases, what masses of molten matter, accumulated beneath its solid surface, with no possible escape after the cooling of the trachytic crust. Therefore, a time came when the fluid and explosive forces of the trapped gases lift up this heavy cover and forced openings for themselves through tall chimneys. Hence, the volcano that had formed in the crust and the crater suddenly created at its summit. Other volcanic phenomena followed. First of all, the ejected basalt of which the plain we had just left preserved such marvelous specimens escaped through the outlets that had now been made. We were walking over dense and massive gray rocks, which, in cooling, had formed hexagonal prisms. Everywhere around us we saw truncated cones, which had formerly been so many fiery mouths. After that, when the basalt flow was exhausted, the volcano, whose power was increased by the extinction of the lesser craters, allowed the escape of lava, ashes, and scoriae, long screes of which I could see flowing down the sides of the mountain like locks of hair. Such was the succession of phenomena which produced Iceland, all arising from the action of internal fire, and to suppose that the material within did not still exist in a state of liquid incandescence was absurd. Nothing could surpass the absurdity of imagining that it was possible to reach the center of the earth. I felt a little comforted by this thought as we advanced to the assault of Snailful. Walking was becoming more and more difficult, and the ascent steeper and steeper. Loose fragments of rock gave way beneath our feet, and the utmost care was needed to avoid dangerous falls. Hans carried on calmly as if he were on level ground. Sometimes he disappeared altogether behind the huge rocks. Then a shrill whistle would direct us towards him. Sometimes he would stop, pick up a few bits of stone, and build them up into a recognizable shape, so making landmarks to guide us in our way back. A very wise precaution in itself, but, as things turned out, quite pointless. 3 hours of tiring walking had only got us as far as the root of the mountain. There Hans made us stop, and a hasty breakfast was served out. My uncle swallowed his food 2 mouthfuls at a time, in order to get on faster, but whether we liked it or not, this was time for a rest, as well as for breakfast, and he had to wait till our guide decided to move on, which he did after about an hour. The three Icelanders, just as taciturn as their friend the hunter, never spoke, and ate their breakfasts in silence. We were now beginning to climb the steep sides of Snappel. By an optical illusion, not uncommon in mountains, its snowy summit seemed very close to us, and yet however many weary hours it took us to reach it. The stones, not held together by soil or fibrous plant roots, rolled away from under our feet, and dropped down into the precipice below with the speed of an avalanche. At some places, the sides of the mountain formed an angle with the horizon of at least 36 degrees. It was impossible to climb these stony cliffs, and we had to work our way around them, not without great difficulty. At these points, we helped each other by means of our sticks. I have to admit, my uncle kept as close to me as he could. He never lost sight of me, and in many difficult places his arm gave me strong support. He himself seemed to possess an instinctive sense of balance, and he never stumbled. The Icelanders, although burdened with our loads, climbed with the agility of mountaineers. To judge by the appearance of the summit of Snapel in the distance, it seemed too steep to climb on the side we were on. Fortunately, after an hour of exhausting exercise, a kind of staircase appeared unexpectedly, in the middle of the vast plain of snow, in the hollow between the two peaks, and it made our ascent much easier. It was formed by one of those torrents of stones flung up by the eruptions, called Stina by the Icelanders. If this torrent had not been arrested in its fall by the shape of the sides of the mountain, it would have carried on down to the sea, and formed more islands. Such as it was, it served us well. The steepness increased, but these stone steps allowed us to climb with ease, and at such a speed that, having rested for a moment while my companions continued their ascent, the distance they had climbed reduced them to microscopic size. At 7, we had ascended the 2,000 steps of this giant staircase, and we had reached a bulge in the mountain, a kind of bed on which rested the actual cone of the crater. 3,200 feet below us stretched the sea. We had passed the lower summit of perpetual snow, which, on account of the dampness of the climate, begins at a lower level than one might expect. It was bitingly cold. The wind was blowing violently. I was exhausted. The professor saw that my legs were refusing to carry me any further, and, in spite of his impatience, he made up his mind to stop. He signaled his intention to the hunter, who shook his head, saying, "Off and for." "It seems we have to go higher," said my uncle. He asked Hans why. "Mistur?" replied the guide. "Ja, Mistur," said one of the Icelanders in a tone of alarm. "What does that word mean?" I asked uneasily. "Look," said my uncle. I looked down to the plain. An immense column of pulverized pumice, sand, and dust was rising with a whirling circular motion like a waterspout. The wind was lashing it onto the very side of Snailful to which we were clinging. This dense veil, hanging in front of the sun, threw a deep shadow over the mountain. If that huge, revolting pillar leant over, it would grasp us in its whirling eddies. This phenomenon, which was not infrequent when the wind blows from the glaciers, is called in Icelandic mistur. Hastigt, hastigt, cried our guide. Without even knowing Danish, I understood at once that we had to follow Hans as fast as we could. He began to circle round the cone of the crater, but on a slanting path, so as to make our progress easier. Presently, the dust storm crashed down on the mountain, which shook with the shock of it. A hail of loose stones, caught up by the irresistible blasts of wind, flew about as if in a volcanic eruption. Fortunately, we were on the other side of the mountain and sheltered from harm. But for the prudence of our guide, our mangled bodies, torn and pounded into fragments, would have been carried far away, like the remnants of some unknown meteor. Nevertheless, Hans didn't think it wise to spend the night on the side of the cone. We continued on our zigzag climb. The remaining 1,500 feet took us 5 hours to cover. The diagonal path, the circuitous route, and the need to retrace our steps from time to time must have made for a walk of at least 3 leagues. I could hardly keep going any longer. I was succumbing to the effects of hunger and cold. The rarefied air was scarcely enough to fill my lungs. At last, at 11 o'clock in the sunlit night, we reached the summit of Snailful, and before taking shelter in the crater, I had time to watch the midnight sun, at its lowest point, gliding with its pale rays the island that slept at my feet. Chapter 16. Boldly Down into the Crater. Supper was gobbled down, and our little company settled itself as best it could. The bed was hard, the shelter not very substantial, and our position an anxious one, at 5,000 feet above sea level. Yet I slept very well indeed. It was one of the best nights I had ever had, and I didn't even dream. Next morning we awoke half frozen in the keen air, but with the light of a splendid sun. I got up from my granite bed and went out to enjoy the magnificent spectacle that lay unfolding before my eyes. I was standing on the very summit of the southernmost of Snapel's peaks. I could see over the whole island. By an optical effect that you get at all great heights, it seemed as if the shores had been raised up and the central part of the island had sunk down. It was as though one of Helbosmer's relief maps lay at my feet. I could see deep valleys crisscrossing each other in every direction, precipices like low walls, lakes reduced to ponds, rivers abbreviated into streams. On my right were countless glaciers and innumerable peaks, some surrounded by feathery clouds of smoke. The undulating surface of these endless mountains, crested with sheets of snow, reminded me of a stormy sea. If I looked westward, there lay an ocean spread out in all its magnificence, like a mere continuation of those fleecy summits. My eye could hardly tell where the snowy ridges ended and the foaming waves began. I was now able to steep myself in the wonderful ecstasy which all high summits produce in the mind without any feeling of dizziness, as I was beginning to get accustomed to these sublime aspects of nature. My dazzled eyes were bathed in the bright flood of the sun's rays. I was forgetting where I was and who I was, living rather the life of elves and sylphs, whose fanciful creations of Scandinavian superstition. I felt intoxicated by the sublime pleasure of lofty peaks, without thinking of the deep abysses into which I was shortly to be plunged. But I was brought back to reality by the arrival of Hans and the professor, who joined me on the summit. My uncle pointed out to me in the far west a light mist, a haze, a suggestion of land, on the distant horizon beyond the waves. "That's Greenland," he said. "Greenland?" I exclaimed. "Yes, we're only 35 leagues away, and during thaws polar bears are carried by the ice fields from the north even as far as Iceland. But never mind that. Here we are at the top of Snapple, and here are 2 peaks, one to the north and one to the south. Hans will tell us the name of the one we are standing on at the moment." Question being asked, Hans replied, "Skutaris." My uncle shot a triumphant glance at me. "Now for the crater," he cried. The crater of Snapple resembled an inverted cone, the opening of which might be half a league in diameter. It appeared to be about 2,000 feet deep. Imagine what such a reservoir would look like, brimming and running over with liquid fire and rumbling like rolling thunder. The bottom of the funnel was about 250 feet in circumference, so its lower edge could be reached without much difficulty down the gentle slope. I couldn't help thinking that the whole crater was like an enormous blunderbuss, and the comparison absolutely terrified me. What madness it is, I thought, to go down into a blunderbuss, perhaps a loaded blunderbuss, to be shot up into the air without warning. But I didn't try to back up. Perfectly calm, Hans resumed the lead, and I followed him without a word. To make the descent easier, Hans wound his way down the cone by a spiral path. A route lay through the rocks that were the result of past eruptions. Loosened from their beds by our feet, some of the rocks bounced down into the abyss, creating their fall remarkable loud echoes. In some parts of the cone there were glaciers. Here, Hans moved forward with extreme caution, using his iron-tipped pole to check for crevasses. At particularly doubtful sections, we had to tie ourselves together with a long rope, so that anybody who missed his footing would be held up by his companions. This was a wise move, but it didn't remove all the danger. Yet, notwithstanding the difficulties of the descent, down slopes the guide was not familiar with, it was accomplished without accident, except for the loss of a coil of rope, which escaped from the hands of an Icelander and took the shortest way to the bottom of the abyss. We arrived at midday. I looked up and saw, straight above me, the upper opening of the cone, framing a very small but almost perfectly round bit of sky. Just at the edge of the opening, the snowy peaks of Scartaris stood out sharp and clear against the infinities of space. At the bottom of the crater, there were 3 chimneys, through which, in its eruptions, Snappel would have belched out fire and lava from its central furnace. Each of these chimneys was 100 feet in diameter. They stood gaping right in front of us. I hadn't the courage to look down any of them, but Professor Liedenbrock had hastily surveyed all 3. He was panting and puffing, running from one to the other, gesticulating and uttering incoherent noises. Hans and his companions were sitting on loose lava rocks, watching him. They obviously thought he was quite mad. Suddenly, my uncle gave a shout. I thought his foot must have slipped and that he'd fallen down one of the holes, but he hadn't. I could see him, arms outstretched and legs wide apart, standing in the center of the crater, in front of a granite rock that looked just like a pedestal, made for a statue of Pluto. For a moment he stood like a man transfixed, but that soon gave way to delirious joy. "Axel! Axel!" he cried. "Come quickly! Come down here!" I ran down. Hans and the Icelanders had just stayed where they were. "Look!" cried the professor. And, sharing his astonishment, but not, I think, his joy, I read on the western face of the block, in runic characters, half crumbled away with the passage of time, this thrice accursed name. "Arne Signussum," replied my uncle. "Do you still have doubts now?" I said nothing, and returned in silence to my lava seat, in a state of utter consternation. I was completely crushed by the evidence. How long I remained deep in thought I cannot say. All I know is that when I looked up again, I could see only my uncle and Hans at the bottom of the crater. The Icelanders had been dismissed, and they were now descending the outer slopes of Snailful to return to Stapi. Hans was sleeping peacefully at the foot of the rock, in a lava bed, where he had found a suitable place to lie down. But my uncle was pacing around the bottom of the crater like a wild animal in a cage. I had neither the desire nor the strength to get up, and following the guide's example, I dropped off into an unhappy slumber, imagining I could hear ominous noises or feel tremblings within the recesses of the mountain. That is how we spent our first night in the crater. The next morning, a gray, heavy cloud seemed to be hanging over the summit of the cone. This I discovered not from the darkness in the crater, but from my uncle's uncontrollable anger. I soon found out the cause of his anger, and for this reason hope dawned again in my heart. Of the 3 paths that lay open before us, only one had been taken by Signussum. What that learned Icelander had hinted at in the cryptograms was that the shadow of Scartaris touched that particular opening during the final days in the month of June. That sharp peak might therefore be considered as the gnomon of a vast sundial, the shadow projected from which on a certain day would indicate the way to the center of the earth. Now, no sun means no shadow, and therefore no indicator. And it was now June the 25th. If the sun stayed hidden by the cloud for 6 days, we'd have to postpone our visit till next year. My limited powers of description would be insufficient to attempt a picture of the professor's angry impatience. The day wore on, and no shadow came to lay itself along the bottom of the crater. Hans didn't move from the spot he had selected, yet he must have been wondering what we were waiting for, if the matter crossed his mind at all. My uncle had said not a word to me. His gaze, always directed upwards, was lost in the grey and misty space beyond. On the 26th, still nothing. A mixture of rain and snow fell all day long. Hans built a hut of pieces of lava. I felt a miraculous or a malicious pleasure in watching the thousands of streams and cascades that came tumbling down the sides of the cone, and the continuous deafening noise made by the stones they struck in passing. My uncle's rage knew no bounds. It was enough to infuriate a much more mild-tempered man than he was, because his plans were foundering just like a boat that hits some rocks when almost in the harbor. But heaven never sends unmingled grief, and for Professor Liedenbrock there was satisfaction in store proportionate to his desperate anxieties. The next day, the sky was again overcast, but on the 29th of June, the last day of the month but one, with a change of the moon came a change of the weather. The sun poured a flood of light down the crater. Every hillock, every rock and stone, every projecting surface shared in this torrent of brightness and threw its shadow on the ground. Amongst them, Scartaris laid down his sharp, pointed, angular shadow, which began to move slowly in the opposite direction to that of the shining globe. My uncle followed the shadow as it moved. At noon, now at its shortest, it licked gently at the edge of the middle chimney. "There it is! There it is!" shouted the professor. "Now, for the center of the earth," he added in Danish. I looked at Hans to hear what he would say. "All right," was his calm reply. "Forward," replied my uncle. It was 13 minutes past 1. All right, Chapter 17, Vertical Descent. Now our real journey began. Up to this point, our efforts had been equal to all the difficulties we had faced, but now new difficulties would spring up at every step. I had still not taken a look down the bottomless pit into which I was about to plunge, but the moment of truth had arrived. I could now either take part in the enterprise or refuse to go on, but I was ashamed to turn back in the presence of the hunter. Hans was accepting the adventure with such calmness, such indifference, such a perfect disregard for any possible danger, that I blushed at the very thought of being less brave than him. If I'd been alone, I might have tried once again to argue my uncle out of it, but in the presence of the guide I held my peace. I thought of my sweet Verland girl, and I walked toward the central chimney. I have already mentioned that it was 100 feet in diameter and 300 feet round. I leant over a projecting rock and looked down. My hair stood on end with terror. A dizzying feeling of emptiness gripped me. I felt my center of gravity moving, and a mounting giddiness was affecting my brain, just as if I were like drunk. There is nothing more treacherous than this feeling of attraction down into a deep abyss. I was just about to let myself fall when a hand took hold of me. It was Hans. Obviously, I hadn't taken as many lessons in abyss exploration as I should have done in the Felsers Kirk in Copenhagen. But, short as my examination of this well had been, I had formed some idea of its shape and structure. Its almost perpendicular walls were bristling with innumerable projections, which would facilitate our descent. But, even if there was no lack of steps, there was still no rail. A rope fastened to the edge of the aperture might have helped us down, but how would we unfasten it when we reached the other end? My uncle used a very simple expedient to get round this difficulty. He uncoiled a rope from which was about the thickness of a thumb and 400 feet long. First he dropped half of it down, then he wound it round a lava block that was sticking out conveniently, and threw the other half down the chimney. Each of us could then descend by holding both halves of the rope, which would not be able to unwind itself from where it was attached. When we got 200 feet down, it would be easy to get the whole rope again, by letting go of one end and pulling it down by the other. Then the exercise would be repeated, ad infinitum. "Now," said my uncle, after having completed these preparations, "let's think about our packs. I'll divide what we have to carry into 3 bundles, and each of us will carry one on his back. I'm only talking about the fragile articles. We, of course, were not included under that heading. Hans will take charge of the tools and one part of the provisions. You, Axel, We'll take another third of the provisions and the firearms, and I will carry the rest of the provisions and the delicate instruments. But, I said, what about the clothes and that pile of ladders and ropes? What are we going to do with them? They'll go by themselves. How? I asked. Well, you'll see. My uncle was always willing to take drastic action unhesitatingly. As commanded by my uncle, Hans bundled up all the non-fragile articles, tied them firmly together, and simply dropped them down the abyss that lay in front of us. I listened to the dark, dull thuds of the bundle as it fell. My uncle, leaning over the abyss, followed the descent of the luggage with a look of satisfaction, and only stood up when he could no longer see it. That's fine. Now it's our turn. Now, I would ask any sensible person, could anyone hear such words without a shudder? The professor fastened his pack of instruments to his back. Hans took the tools, I took the firearms, and our descent began in the following order. Hans, my uncle, myself. It was all done in a deep silence, broken only by the sound of loose stones falling down into the dark abyss. I let myself drop, as it were, frantically clutching the double rope with one hand and using the other to keep myself off the wall by means of my stick. One thought almost overwhelmed me, a fear that the rock I was hanging from might give way. The rope seemed very flimsy to be bearing the weight of 3 people. I made as little use of it as possible, performing wonderful feats of balance and lava projections, which my feet tried to catch hold of like hands. When one of these insecure footholds became dislodged under Hans's foot, he said in his calm voice, "Get hacked." "Watch out," replied my uncle. In half an hour we were standing on the surface of a rock that was jammed across the chimney. Hans pulled on one of the ends of the rope, and the other rose in the air. After passing the rock up above, it came down again, bringing with it a rather dangerous shower of bits of stone and lava. Leaning over the edge of our narrow perch, I could see that the bottom of the hole was still out of sight. The same maneuver with the rope was repeated, and half an hour later we had descended another 200 feet. I don't suppose even the maddest geologist would, under such circumstances, have studied the nature of the rocks we were passing. I can tell you I didn't give them any thought. Pliocene, Miocene, Eocene, Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Carboniferous, Devonian, Silurian, or Primitive, it was all one to me. But the professor was certainly continuing with his observations or taking notes, as during one of our stops he said to me, "The farther I go, the more confident I feel. The order of these volcanic formations strongly confirms Davy's theories. We are now among the earliest rocks which have been subjected to chemical actions which are produced by the contact of elementary bases of metals with water. I reject the whole idea of central heat altogether. We'll see further proof very soon." Still the same conclusion. Of course, I wasn't inclined to agree. My silence was taken for consent, and our descent continued. Another 3 hours, and I could still see no bottom to the chimney. When I looked up, I could see the opening, which was getting noticeably smaller. The walls, sloping gently inwards, were coming closer together. It was steadily getting darker. Still, we kept going down. It seemed to me that the dislodged stones were being swallowed up with a duller sound, and that they must be reaching the bottom of the abyss more quickly. As I had been careful to keep an exact note of our maneuvers with the rope, which I knew we had repeated 14 times, and each descent had taken half an hour, it was easy to calculate that we had been working our way down for 7 hours. With 14 quarter of an hour rests, that made 10.5 hours. We had started off at 1 o'clock, so it must now be 11 o'clock, and the depth to which we had descended must be 14 times 200 feet, or 2,800 feet. At that moment I heard Hans's voice. "Halt!" he shouted. I stopped dead, just as my feet were about to land on my uncle's head. "We're there," he cried. "Where?" I said, sliding down beside him. "At the bottom of the perpendicular chimney," he answered. "Is there no way of going further?" "Yes. There's a sort of passage with slopes down to the right. We'll take a look at it tomorrow. Let's have supper and go to sleep." We were not yet in total darkness. The food pack was opened, we had our refreshment, and then went to sleep as well as we could on a bed of stones and lava fragments. When I was lying on my back, I opened my eyes and saw a bright, shining point of light at the top of the gigantic 3,000-foot-long tube, now a huge telescope. It was a star which, seen from this depth, had lost all its twinkle, and which, by my calculations, would be the Beta star of the Little Bear. Then I fell fast asleep. All right, so that's going to do it for us today, inching closer and closer to the core of the planet. Up next, we've got Chapter 18, The Wonders of the Terrestrial Depths, but that's going to have to wait until next week. Thank you very much for joining me again, and I'll be seeing you later.